A storm had nearly swallowed the Wyoming Territory that night in 1887. Rain hammered the prairie, lightning tore across the black sky, and a widowed rancher named Caleb Mercer was riding home. When he saw a woman standing beside a wrecked wagon with a baby pressed against her chest, he should have kept riding. He had no business involving himself in a stranger's trouble. But then the lightning flashed again, and he saw the baby's tiny face, pale from the cold. The woman stepped toward him, trembling beneath a torn shawl. "Please, sir," she whispered, "we aren't asking for food or money." She looked toward the distant darkness behind her. "May we sleep in your barn?" Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't alone on that road. Someone was following her. If stories about courage, kindness, and unexpected second chances touch your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Meaningful Impact 2.1, because tonight's story begins with one lonely rancher opening his barn door, and ends with a secret that could change an entire town. Caleb Mercer was 42 years old, and had spent the last 2 winters learning how quiet a house could become after losing the person who made it feel like home. His wife, Margaret, had died 2 years earlier, leaving him with a working ranch, several dozen cattle, and a silence he had never learned to break. He rarely visited town. He spoke mostly to his horse, his cattle, and the occasional ranch hand who came by for work. Caleb didn't consider himself cruel. He simply believed the world had already taken enough from him. That evening, however, the world placed someone else's sorrow directly in his path. The woman's name was Clara Bennett. She was 25, exhausted, soaked to the skin, and holding a baby girl who couldn't have been more than a few months old. Caleb helped her onto his horse and walked beside them through the rain. He asked where her husband was. Clara hesitated before answering. "He's gone." Caleb asked whether he was dead. She looked away. "I don't know." That answer told Caleb more than a long explanation could have. At the ranch, he brought Clara into the barn and lit the kerosene lamps. He started the iron stove, found dry blankets, and brought out food. Clara tried to thank him, but her voice broke when she saw the warm meal. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Caleb pretended not to notice. Then he noticed the baby. The little girl was wrapped in a thin, faded blanket. Caleb saw that Clara kept checking it as though it contained something precious. "What's her name?" he asked. "Lily." Caleb nodded. "Pretty name." Clara looked at him. "My husband chose it." She said no more. Later, while the storm raged outside, Clara finally fell asleep beside the stove. Caleb sat near the barn entrance, watching the rain through a crack in the wooden door. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, not one horse, several. Caleb stood. The hoofbeats stopped outside the ranch house. A man's voice carried through the rain. "We know she's here." Clara woke instantly. Her face turned white. Caleb looked at her. "Who are they?" She clutched Lily tighter. "Yin who won't stop until they get what I have." "What do you have?" Clara slowly reached inside Lily's blanket. Before she could answer, the barn door shook beneath a violent knock. "Open up." Caleb grabbed his rifle. Another voice shouted from outside. "Clara Bennett, we know you're inside." Clara began crying silently. Caleb moved between her and the door. Then one of the riders shouted something that made Clara freeze. "We're not here for the woman." A pause. "You're here for what's hidden in the baby's blanket." Caleb looked at Clara. She finally pulled out a small leather packet. Inside were pages covered with names, numbers, land descriptions, and signatures. Caleb recognized some of the names. They belonged to ranchers who had mysteriously lost their land. "What is this?" he whispered. Clara's voice trembled. "The reason my husband disappeared." Outside, the men began forcing the barn door. Caleb looked at the old wooden walls. There were 3 armed men outside, one frightened mother, one baby, and one secret powerful enough to destroy the richest man in the county. Then Caleb noticed something behind Clara, a small window, too narrow for a grown man, but wide enough for a mother carrying a baby. He pointed toward it. "Get ready to run," and just as the barn door began to crack, Caleb fired his rifle into the ceiling. The horses exploded into motion. The riders outside stumbled backward. Caleb shouted, "Ye now." Clara climbed through the window with Lily. Caleb followed, and the 3 of them disappeared into the storm, but they had no idea that one of the men had already seen where they went. Caleb led Clara and Lily through a narrow trail behind the ranch, using the storm as cover. They moved toward an abandoned line shack hidden beyond the northern pasture. The rain made the trail almost impossible to follow, but Caleb knew every ridge and creek for miles. When they reached the shack, he barred the door and lit a small oil lamp. Clara placed Lily beside the stove, and finally opened the leather packet completely. Inside were dozens of handwritten records. They showed that Silas Crowley, the wealthiest cattleman in the county, had been illegally taking land from struggling homesteaders. His men would arrive with forged debts and false signatures. Families who couldn't pay were forced off their property. Some disappeared. Others simply gave up and left the territory. Caleb stared at the pages. My neighbor's name is here. Clara nodded. So is my husband's. Caleb looked at her. Your husband worked for Crowley? He did, and he stole these records. No, Clara whispered, he copied them. She explained that her husband had discovered Crowley's scheme while working as a bookkeeper. When he threatened to expose him, Crowley ordered his men to silence him. Clara escaped with Lily and the evidence, believing her husband was dead. Yet Caleb noticed something strange. One page was dated only 3 days earlier. His eyes narrowed. Clara, she looked at him. Your husband may still be alive. Before she could answer, someone knocked on the shack door. 3 slow knocks. Caleb raised his rifle. The knock came again, then a weak male voice whispered through the wood. Clara. Clara froze, her eyes widened. She knew that voice. Thomas. The door opened. A wounded man stumbled inside. It was Thomas Bennett. Clara rushed toward him, tears filling her eyes. For a moment neither spoke. Thomas looked at Lily, then at Clara. I thought they had you. Clara held him tightly. I thought you were dead. Thomas looked toward Caleb. You saved them. Caleb lowered his rifle. Looks like we all need to get out of here. Thomas nodded, but then he revealed the final piece of the secret. The records weren't the only evidence. Crowley had bribed the sheriff, the county clerk, and several officials, but Thomas had secretly mailed copies of the original documents to a federal marshal in Cheyenne. The marshal was already on his way. They only needed to survive until he arrived. At sunrise, Caleb took Clara, Thomas, and Lily toward the nearest settlement. They were almost there when Crowley's riders appeared on the ridge. 6 men, all armed. Caleb stopped the wagon. Thomas looked frightened. Clara held Lily close. Then Caleb noticed the old wooden bridge ahead. He had an idea. He drove the wagon across first, then cut the rope, holding a heavy stack of timber beside the bridge. The timber crashed down behind them, blocking the trail and forcing the riders to stop. They reached the settlement. The federal marshal was waiting. Thomas handed over the evidence. Within days, Crowley's entire operation began to collapse. The corrupt sheriff was arrested. The county clerk confessed. Families who had lost their homes came forward, and Silas Crowley was finally taken away in handcuffs. But Caleb's greatest victory wasn't seeing Crowley arrested. It happened several weeks later. The rain returned. Caleb was standing beneath the barn roof when Clara walked toward him carrying Lily. She smiled. You remember the first thing I ever asked you? Caleb looked at the barn. How could I forget? Clara smiled. May we sleep in your barn? Caleb laughed softly. You can stay as long as you want. Lily reached toward him. Caleb picked her up. The little girl grabbed his beard and laughed. For the first time since Margaret's death, Caleb heard laughter inside his barn. And something inside him finally changed. He realized that grief had taught him how to survive. But kindness had taught him how to live again. Clara and Thomas eventually settled on a small piece of land nearby. Lily grew up riding horses with Caleb and calling his ranch the safe place. Years later, whenever a storm rolled across the Wyoming prairie, Caleb would remember the night a frightened mother appeared beside a broken wagon. He had believed he was simply giving shelter to a stranger. He never knew that one open barn door would save a family, expose a corrupt empire, restore stolen land, and bring warmth back into a lonely man's life. Sometimes a miracle doesn't arrive looking like a miracle, sometimes it arrives soaked by rain, sometimes it carries a baby, and sometimes all it asks is, may we sleep in your barn? If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Meaningful Impact 2.1 for more emotional old American frontier stories about courage, sacrifice, kindness, mystery, and second chances. And remember, you never know how much one small act of kindness can change someone's entire life.